Hey everyone, it's Eric Chabot here. I am the director of Ratio Christi Apologetics Alliance at The Ohio State University. I also blog regularly at my blog called thinkapologetics.com. I've been a Christian for a number of years. I came to faith in my early 20s. But I just want to talk a little bit today about the relationship between evangelism and apologetics. Having done this for a while, sometimes there are a lot of questions and some confusion out there as to, how exactly does apologetics apply to our evangelistic outreach, and what is the relationship between the two? So I want to take a little time to talk about that today. Now, first and foremost, you need to understand that all of us, if we've read the Bible and we are committed to our faith, we know that Jesus commands us in Matthew 28:19 to go and make disciples of all the nations, or what we call in Hebrew the words Talmudim. So he commands us to go, and wherever our circles of influence are, we don't necessarily have to go over to another country. We don't necessarily have to travel to another state. We can make disciples wherever we are. So when we do that, we make the commitment to do that. We step out and we attempt to share the gospel or the good news with those around us. Most likely run into objections or questions about what we believe and why we believe. Now, we need to remember that evangelism is the proclamation of the gospel. Evangelism is proclaiming the good news, whereas apologetics is giving the reasons for what we believe and the why we believe. So most likely there will be some overlap between the two, because when we do share the message of the good news, whatever context you give the gospel, it was presented in so many different contexts in the Bible, from the kingdom of God gospel to the death and resurrection gospel to the gospel about Jesus being the one from the Old Testament that had come, the prophet, the Messiah. Whatever context you present that in, there's generally going to be questions. But we need to remember, of course, that evangelism is proclaiming the gospel. That is not apologetics, two different things, okay? Now, within the apologetics world, there have been a number of books written about apologetics and apologetic literature that's been written to help Christians or followers of Jesus to learn the basics of apologetics. And there's also been a number of books that have been written about different kinds of apologetic methodology. Now, when I was pretty new to the apologetics field, this book here came out around the same time, and it's called 5 Views of Apologetics. And it had a number of different scholars in this talk about their different views of apologetics, their apologetic methodology. For example, one chapter was by William Lane Craig. He's a well-known Christian apologist. He talks about the classical model. We had Gary Habermas in the book talk about the evidential model. Paul Feinberg talked about the cumulative case model. John Frame represented what's called the presuppositional model. And Kelly James Clark represented the reformed epistemological model. Well, most recently, we have had another book come out called Mapping Apologetics, talking about the contemporary debate about apologetics. And in this book, this author talks about the different apologetic strategies that are out there. Now, I don't necessarily want to debate which one's correct, but there have been a slew of books written on different apologetic styles. So if I was new to apologetics and someone said to me, which they do, they come to me and they say, well, how do I get started? How do I learn about apologetics? Because I really want to engage the culture. I'm desirous to reach out, but people just have so many objections. They have so many questions. Where do I begin? Like, what do I do? Well, I'm going to go ahead and recommend some reading here and talk a little bit about it. If I was brand new to the apologetics endeavor, meaning that I was just getting started, I would start with some of these books. I would recommend reading I Don't Have Faith to Be an Atheist by my friend Frank Turek and Dr. Norm Geisler. That is a very extensive book, a lot of good material in there. Frank and Norm Geisler go over really what's called a 12-point classical model of apologetics, but I think that's a good resource. Another book that just came out more recently is Frank Turek's newer book, Stealing from God. It's called Why Atheists Need God to Make Their Case, and basically he just talks about in this book what explains reality better, theism or atheism. Theism is a belief in a personal God in the world. Atheism, of course, is defined different ways, but bottom line is that there is no God in atheism. So this is a good book to read as well, because it talks about which explains reality better, atheism or theism. Another couple books that have come out over the last few years that are excellent resources are by James Warner Wallace. He's written a book called Cold Case Christianity. He was a former homicide detective, and he uses his homicide detective skills to talk about the reliability of the Gospels, and he has a very unique approach in this book. And then more recently, he came out with a book called God's Crime Scene. It's called A Cold Case Detective Examines the Evidence for a Divinely Created Universe. So this book right here really talks a little more about the evidence for God just from the scientific perspective. He's not so much doing the historical apologetics in this book. He does that more in the Cold Case Christianity book. But this is an excellent resource as well. I would say these 4 books are very good starting points. If I was starting out apologetics, I think that's enough to get your appetite whet and get you going. Now, as you move on, though, in the apologetic field, you'll probably notice that, especially when you do evangelism, you'll probably notice that a lot of people have a hard time or have a lot of objections to miracles. Christianity and biblical faith is really built on biblical miracles. God has to be able to do miracles in the world, or otherwise our faith is really not really that unique at all. Of course, the resurrection of Jesus is a divine miracle in our view. Jesus rose from the dead. That's a miracle. God who creates the universe, Jesus' miracles. These are all unique and rare events, and they're not common every day. We obviously don't see people rising from the dead all the time, because if they did, Jesus wouldn't be that unique. So sometimes we hear a lot of objections to miracles, and I just want to recommend another resource. It's called In Defense of Miracles, a comprehensive case for God's actions in history. So this is a series of essays, came out quite a few years back, but this is an excellent resource to get you going on the philosophical objections to miracle, the historical objections, and it really can help you make a case for why miracles are actual and possible. Okay. Now, as you move forward, you probably notice that when it comes to apologetics and evangelism, you might hear objections from your own Christian friends to apologetics. They might say, well, I don't really need to learn apologetics. I just share the gospel. I just use the word of God. That's all I need, and I have faith, and there's no need to provide reasons or evidences for the existence of God or why Jesus rose from the dead. Well, let me say a couple things about this. As I already said, no, you don't. When it comes to the gospel is not apologetics. You should share the gospel. As a matter of fact, that's what I do before anything else, is I share the good news of Jesus to others before I even have to deal with apologetics. But the reality is that many, many people have to have objections to the faith. And we just have to understand that if you're going to be out there sharing your faith, you will hear objections. So to say that you don't need to learn any of the reasons or evidences is just ignorance. And not to mention, we see all throughout the Bible, especially New Testament, that the apostles were giving reasons and evidence for who Jesus was. They talked about messianic prophecy. They talked about eyewitness testimony. They talked about the resurrection. When Paul was dealing with a Greek audience, he primarily appealed to natural theology or just the existence of God. He'd start with the God of the Bible, establishing who God was. Now, there were, of course, healings and supernatural things that are happening, but we need to remember that there was apologetics being done by the early apostles. Now, a couple things we need to remember is that when we do apologetics, sometimes we talk to skeptics or atheists about the existence of the universe, or we talk about why the universe is set up the way it is. These kinds of arguments fall in the domain of what we call natural theology. Now, this book right here called The Blackwell Companion to Natural Theology is a very academic book. I recommend it, but it's a very academic book. But we need to remember that God reveals himself to the world primarily in 2 ways, through natural theology and through revealed theology or historical theology. So it's always good to know some of the natural theology arguments, such as the arguments about the universe, or philosophical arguments, the argument from contingency, some of the other philosophical arguments. But we need to always remember that not all natural theology arguments will get people all the way to the God of the Bible. Natural theology kind of stops and at a certain point, and then we need to ask people if they're willing to go into history and they're willing to look to see if God has spoken somewhere in history, whether he's shown up, whether he's revealed more of himself and what he wants for humanity. And that's why we believe that that Jesus obviously is God's revelation to humanity. And that's why we need to ask whether Jesus really is the promised Messiah of Israel and of the whole world, and whether God has spoken in history through Jesus, and of course whether he rose from the dead. These are a couple resources here. The Case for the Resurrection of Jesus by my friend Mike Lacona and Gary Habermas, and this is a great book on Messianic prophecy by a few different authors here. So no matter how far we take people, and let's say, you get them to believe there's a God who created the universe, or he created the first life, or we show them some of the intelligent design arguments like Stephen Meyer's work on Darwin's doubt, some of this work on DNA and the information theory or things like that. Even if we give people evidence that's convincing for them that there's some sort of God in the world of nature, as I just said, it's not going to get them all the way to the God of the Bible. We've got to go further and ask them to look into history and then see if God has spoken somewhere. And that's what we, of course, are talking about with Jesus. And that's why, once again, this book is very important about in defense of miracles here. So the important thing is that just from experience, I just want to say a few things. The more you learn about how to articulate your faith into the world around you, I do believe the more opportunities you're going to have to share your faith. Remember, God can use you in so many different circumstances and with so many different people from so many different backgrounds if you're willing to put in the time and the homework. And as long as you only stick with, well, I just need to share the gospel and know the Bible, that's good. You do need that, but that's not going to help you in many of your conversations. And just remember one thing also as I kind of wrap up here. When it comes to the Bible, just remember that Muslims and Mormons and other people from different religions all are just as committed to their faith as you are, and they all believe that they have the divinely revealed text. The book, Mormons believe the Book of Mormon is their text, and Muslims are just as committed to the Quran as you are to the Bible. And there's other religions, they're committed to other texts. So the point of the matter is that the question is God confusing the world? Is he speaking through all these different revelations that are all contradictory? Or has he really spoken through one revelation? And if you don't know anything about apologetics, you will not be able to deal with that topic with people. There are just too many different faiths out there and too many different beliefs, and you will not be able to go far in your discussions with people by simply sticking with the Bible and the gospel. Two very important things, but you're going to have to go further than that. So having said that, I hope this kind of whets your appetite towards evangelism and apologetics. I do believe if you make a commitment to obey God, you want him to use you in your circle of influences, wherever you are, your work, your community, your neighborhood, I believe he'll do that. But just remember that we can go further in our conversations with people if we just learn some of the basics about what we believe and why we believe. Take care.